Hello, and welcome to another live stream. Good to have you all here, watching from wherever you're watching from. Always good to see. We were showing the map a little bit there in the pre-show, which is nice, and we can check back in on that later if anyone wants to say where they're coming from. Alex as well, saying he tuned in to see if I flare my arms around like one of those inflatables in a car lot, and I just happened to see that on time, so you got your wish, Alex. I did what was requested, but I will cut that out of this video on demand version, so no one will ever see that after the fact. If you've any questions or anything like that that pop up into your mind as we go through the show, do try to tag at here to record as well, so I can see them nice and clear, and so that Sani, the question asker, it can see them and puts them in the right list, and then we'll get to them as the show goes on. But mostly today I wanted to talk a little bit about a show I did last week, which was a fully remote 24-hour live stream. I could sit here in the office and do all of my part while the show happened throughout the world. A lot of people in the US and a bunch of people in the EU, since there was a 24-hour time gap to fill. And we ran through the show. And let me see, if I dig into that in a few seconds, I will. Now, the whole point of this sort of behind the scenes look is actually a bit of a strange one. What I'll talk about is some of the processes, some of the lessons learned about doing things fully remote like that. But what I can't specifically dig into in this live stream is the actual content that we produced, purely because I never asked for permission to show any of that stuff, and I wouldn't want to show anything without asking first. I have a feeling that people will say yes to that, but I only really decided to do this live show on Friday, and here we are doing it now. So there wasn't much time to reach out and get permission from all the right people. So I will dig into a H2R gear plan that kind of goes through a lot of the technical processes, and then I can take any of your questions about it on sort of a top level. And then if the permission comes through, or if there's more to dig in on in the future, then I'll certainly do that as well. But why don't we just, before we launch in much further, I think we'll throw up the map again and see if there's anyone else that just came in there last minute into the show. Alex here from London, nice to have you here. Anyone else? Hello from India as well. And Tim Tech Streaming, that was harder to say than I thought. Derby in the UK. And at Pyramid 7, I saw your first time here, nice to have you here. And that was slick, the maps, push pins, very nice. Yeah, that's a feature built into H2R graphics, where you can show pins on the map and see where everyone's coming from in your audience, so long as they say where they're from in the chat, and then we can show that message, and it drops a little pin there. I don't know why it went away between the previous pin showing and the new pin showing, but maybe I'll make a note of that and see if I can solve that before the next live stream happens. Okay, cool. That's everybody for now. Thank you for the chats and the hellos from all over the place. You may have been too slow if you've just seen this and said it now. Cool. Before we go any further though, I just realized I don't have much water left, so I'm going to ask Sani, can you fill up my water? Is that okay? Thank you. That's why it's nice to have someone with you here in the studio. Otherwise it would have been a quiet stream for a few minutes while I ran off and did that. Where else? Hello from Georgia and from Sydney as well. Nice to have you both here. All right, let me dig into the gear plan, which I will be using today as more of a illustration purposes, as opposed to what I usually use it for, which is planning of equipment. Let me see this one. So this is a quick little plan I put together as a sort of overview of some of the technical stuff that went into this production, some of the lessons that I learned along the way, and some of the gear that we used to make this happen. Now, like I said, I was locationed. I was positioned here in Sweden, and then we had, thank you. We had Jonas, who's been on the channel before, was the engineer in charge, based in Germany, and we were using all of his company's equipment in the cloud, running vMix, running Zoom calls, running all sorts of stuff. And the production itself mostly was happening in the US. And that's why here on the first little part of my time zone is 00 Central European time is when the production actually started. So while us Europeans were asleep, the US crew kicked off the production. I think Jonas actually stayed up for most of this because it was his company, BSC MP Global, that ran the whole production. So at midnight, my time, the US crew started the show and started all of the live streaming, a lot of interviews, and Zoom hosts jumping in from the US. And then come 6 o'clock in the morning, my time, we joined the Zoom call where the main production was happening, and everyone from the US handed over their roles, and then we spent about 12 hours here in the EU time zone running the whole show until about 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, evening, where we handed back over to the US crew, and then they did the night shift, well, their day shift, and finished the show again 24 hours later at midnight European time. And the show mostly consisted of hosts who were based in Florida, and they were joining the Zoom call and then bringing in guests from all over the US, asking them questions, and they were giving talks and all sorts of presentations, lots of screen shares, but again, all happening through Zoom. Yeah, I'll just dig into this other things that were used section before I dig into the workflow. We had a full Zoom reset mid-show. I'll come back to that in a minute. We also used Unity Comms for all the communication. So this is like an iOS, Android, Mac, Windows application that lets you connect with all sorts of people. You just give them all the right credentials and you can chat with each other in separate rooms or lines, I guess they call it. And through that, you do all your discussions. So you can talk to the engineering department, you can talk to the client, you can talk to the hosts directly, all via that Unity application. So from there, we also used a Slack text channels, or multiple channels actually, so we could keep in touch with all of the hosts. As the show went on, we needed a way to get in touch with them and get in touch with the team. Things that were not as real time as the Unity all went in there. And then additionally, as the show was happening, as the 24 hours were going through, we were able to edit, not me personally, but there was editors in the US team and in the EU team who were editing content from the live stream as it went across. Things were coming in fast. Edit notes were happening. There was story producers who were watching the show and making notes about like good social comment at 7 minutes in. Real challenge though was deciding what time to go on, like what time of day or what recording time to pinpoint for an editor. But yeah, we can dig into that a bit later as well. And then we had a full Zoom reset. So since the whole show was happening through Zoom over 24 hours, at some point, if a meeting in Zoom lasts for 24 hours, in the past, Jonas and the team have found that it starts to get a bit shaky before the 24 hours are up. And the best way to fix that problem is to stop a Zoom meeting and then restart it. And that's one thing we had scheduled for halfway through the day. We went to like a break on the live stream, and then everyone left the Zoom meeting ended, and then we all rejoined the Zoom meeting, all the hosts, all the guests that were about to come up, all of the Zoom rooms that were involved in pinning people, I'll get to that in a second. Everything that was in that meeting now had to leave and then rejoin that meeting. It was a scary about 60 seconds as we reset everything. So what did a average, actually we can ask that question from Alex before we dig in any further.
Okay, so he wonders, I'm assuming roughly how many guests through the 24 hours?
Good question. So the full 24 hours was divided up into like 20 to 30 minute slots, and each slot would have at least one guest. Some slots were a bit longer than that, like 60 minutes, some maybe 45, but at least 20 minutes each slot. I'm not good at math, so I can't really do that math, but if that's 3 per hour, looking over here to see if someone else is good at math, at least 3 guests per hour, and there was 24 hours, so that would have been about 70 guests. Yeah, that sounds about right. For all of those guests, they needed to, and I asked this question, or brought up this question because it feeds in nicely to what I'm about to say. Every single guest needed to be tech checked, as in audio, video, internet, camera placement, because all of these people were joining via the Zoom call and via their own computers and their own homes or offices. So each of those 70 odd people needed to be tech checked by a session producer who was on the team, a US one and EU one as well. And what they would do, in fact, I can go back to my little diagram here. So we had the Zoom meeting running, and everyone started, I suppose, outside of the Zoom room. And then a host would join at the start of the show, and maybe a guest would join. And from there, we would want to bring them into a tech check area. So there was an extra breakout room in the call, and our session producer would bring that guest into the breakout room, the tech check breakout room, and go through a quite intense check with them. So checking their, I think there was about 20 steps on the tech check. So speed test just to get a grasp of what their connection might be like, questions about their connection, Wi-Fi, wireless, almost always Wi-Fi, of course. Then maybe they were sitting in front of or behind a window, moving them around, getting their laptop from where it probably was, which is down like this, up in front of their face, checking for their audio setup. And then, of course, almost everybody had a presentation of some sort, which they shared locally via screen sharing. So a test of that to make sure it worked as you'd expect it to. It was quite the list of things to check, but what it meant was whenever they finally left that tech check room, we were pretty confident about the connection that they had. Now, of course, there was plenty of people whose connections were not great, as it is. You never know what kind of intense setup they have if someone else is using the Wi-Fi or using their internet, or maybe they just never had a good connection in the first place. So a lot of it came down to hoping for the best if people had not a great connection. But I think most of the guests had a fairly decent connection. Many had been on these kind of calls before, and they knew what to do, or at least were guided through that via the session producer, how to best get the most out of their connection, grab a cable or get some good lighting so it looks good, and all that stuff. So we'll follow on down through the sections here. So from there, the Zoom guest, whenever the tech check was done, they could be passed into the green room. And you'll notice that's depicted here in green, because we needed a way of sort of placing somebody somewhere while the show happened. Maybe we didn't need them for another 20 minutes. They were told to join 30 minutes before their slot, but you never know. People join 60 minutes sometimes. Sometimes people join 5 minutes before. It happens. And the next Zoom guest would jump into the Zoom meeting, the main area of the meeting, and they would be there ready to be tech checked whenever they had time. Now, of course, the host also went through all of this at the start of the show, so they would go into the breakout room for tech check just to make sure everything worked as you'd expect. In fact, after that big Zoom reset that I talked about earlier, we had to kick everyone out of the meeting and everyone joined back in again. So we did do a quick tech check on the way back in of the hosts as well. For the most part, they weren't checked throughout the day, of course, but if they left and came back, it's always good to just double check. Does the screen share still work as they expect it to? Audio and video all working as they expect it to, hopefully. All right, so the host and the guest are now in the green room, and they are hanging out in there watching the show. I'll come back to this in a minute, but there was a Zoom room, which is what you call these things that you can just connect into Zoom meetings. A Zoom room was placed in the Zoom meeting, and you can send in a program feed or multi-view or whatever you want. So that was in there so that anyone who's hanging out in the green room can see something, see the show, and interact with each other if they want, but they can see what's showing up on the show. From there, we have 3 more breakout rooms. So there's a lot of breakout rooms, and more than I've even shown here on this diagram, but there was a lot of breakout rooms in the meeting. And one of those breakout rooms was used for the hosts. So we actually had multiple hosts in that breakout room, but for now I'm just making it easier and just putting one in there. So when the host's turn was popping up, they could sit in that breakout room and they would be a part of the production. Same goes for the guests. Whenever the guest is part of a production, they can sit in this breakout room called the breakout room guests. Now you'll notice, of course, that these hosts and these guests are in two different breakout rooms. So how did they communicate with each other? Which is quite an interesting challenge whenever you're setting up all of this infrastructure. And nice job to Jonas and Tucker for pulling all this together. Again, living in the cloud. The Zoom meeting, of course, lives in the cloud. The vMix that was switching the show all lives in the cloud. And in order to get into these breakout rooms and pull people out of them, you can use Zoom rooms. So you add the Zoom room to each of the breakout rooms, and then from there you can pull out people, their video and their audio, and then send it wherever you want over NDI. So there was a Zoom room in the breakout room for the hosts, a Zoom room in the breakout room for the guests, and then within another PC, this is one of my tasks, or one of my Macs here, I had the Zoom room pinning web browser software, whatever it's called, up on my computer here. So I could access all three of these Zoom rooms, and I can pin anybody I want to that Zoom room's output. So the Zoom host here would get pinned on output number 1. And in fact, we had multiple hosts, so you could have up to 2 hosts here in this little host section, and then they both can be pinned to the NDI outputs there. Same goes for the guests. The Zoom room is pinning those over NDI, and that signal has been sent via the cloud into a vMix PC. And in this PC, you can bring in all those NDI feeds and then switch between them. Just like any other vMix production that you might have done before, or software-based production, you have all of your inputs coming in. Again, there's a lot more inputs than I'm showing here. I'm just trying to make it sort of simplified so I didn't have to build the whole thing in H2R gear. But all the inputs are coming in, and the technical director can just switch between all of the shots. And what's really nice is you can return multi-views and programs out of this vMix computer, and they're all going NDI back into different rooms. Now I've just thrown it into the green room there, so someone could sit in the green room and watch the program feed or the multi-view feed. We had a multi-view going back to a production breakout room, which is not shown here. You could see multi-view and hear program at all times. And then via these Zoom rooms here, which is not shown on this diagram, audio from the other breakout rooms or from the production was sent back into these breakout rooms. So if you're a host in this breakout room, you can hear and interact with a guest because there's two-way communication set up. It's a bit of a head scratcher to configure all this stuff. You need to kind of jump between the rooms and see, is everything working? But I know that they've got lots of experience with that stuff, and they've figured out all of the issues that can arise from that kind of setup. But needless to say, if you're a host or a guest, whenever you're on air, the other side and the other breakout room can hear you and interact with you and talk to you, just like you would if you were doing a show via Zoom, the traditional way with a pin farm, but a little bit more complicated because of all the breakout rooms. All right, next task is recording and streaming. Now the vMix PC is just streaming off to RTMP, off to YouTube, as you would expect. That way people who are watching online via YouTube, they can do that. The vMix PC has got all the inputs coming in, all the guests all pinned and sending just your standard production. If the guest was to do a screen share, then I could also pin that on the Zoom room, which shows up as an input in vMix, and then it can be shown in vMix SuperSource style layouts. So you can do pretty advanced productions with screen sharing from people going right into these the vMix Cloud PC, and then sent off to the YouTube, what do you call it, stream. Additionally, there is a recording of the program going on. Now, this got slightly more complicated. Typically on a vMix cloud machine, you would log in, see your vMix, and then cut between your cameras, live stream from vMix, press record in vMix, and then at the end of your show, you could stop that recording. But where things get slightly more involved in this production was, like I said before, as the show or the production went on, an editor was waiting to get their piece of footage so they could edit a video on demand or VOD version of each of those 20-minute segments. Now, if the main vMix computer had recorded, a 24-hour recording, not only would I be a bit concerned about hoping for the best that it worked by the end, but sectioning it up as the day went on into 20, 30-minute chunks meant that the editor could grab that and run with it and make small adjustments. They could also pull out little sections for social media as depicted by the story editor that was writing down all the good moments. So here in the vMix cloud, there's actually another computer running, which is running a separate version of vMix. And then the program from vMix computer number 1 is being NDI delivered to vMix computer number 2. And the sole task of that second computer is to press record and press stop record as the day goes on. So I had Parsec access to this computer, so I could log in to vMix computer PC2, and then I could start the recording and pull that file off and upload it to frame.io. The editor on the other end has access to frame.io. They can see the footage when it comes in, or I can tell them the footage is ready. So I've stopped recording, I've dragged it onto frame.io, I've told them that there's a file ready for them to edit, and then they can log in, take a look at it, and go find the document that was stored on the drive with all of the edit notes in there. This way, the main production on that original vMix PC can keep on happening because it's unaffected. It's not having to start recording. This technical director doesn't have to do anything other than just keep on working, because remember, this is a 24-hour show, and while this guest is now off, done for the day, this next guest is now popped in and they're doing their presentation and we're pinning them to the PC. So it's nice to have this separate computer that's logging into this separate recording vMixed instance, and you can take a break after every section and then upload that to frame.io for the person to keep going. Okay, I've been talking too much now. I'll take a little break, some water. Any questions or comments even?
Yes, we have one question from Grant. Is NDI out a native feature of Zoom Rooms, or are you using something separate to get those feeds out?
I wish I had taken a photo of it, but it is a native, unless I'm speaking incorrectly, and I'll update I'll update you, Grant, if I find out otherwise. But it is a native option in the Zoom Rooms. So the Zoom Rooms, whenever you create one and add it to a meeting, you get this web panel. Now, in theory, I believe that web interface is really for a iPad or tablet to sit in a meeting room and you can interact. It's very button friendly, the web interface of a Zoom Room. But there is an option in that Zoom Room called Live NDI. Let me see if I can get a picture of it while we're chatting here. And then in that Live NDI setting section, you can just grab people and pin them off to the outputs. Then from there, you can do whatever you want with that NDI feed. Now that part, I'm not entirely sure where it picked up and left off, because Jonas was very much in charge of this other one. Here's an old picture of, I believe, what it used to look like. There's up to 12 outputs on NDI now, so it looks a bit different than this. But basically, you have these live on NDI outputs, and you can click and add, and it shows anyone who's in that meeting you can send out of that output. Looks a bit different these days. If I had thought about it, I would have gotten an image ready for it. But in there, I could just say, okay, choose participant X and send them out of pin 1 and so on and so forth. And that was how we did that. Any more questions before I go on to the last parts?
So, some comments or from Eric. It's been busy in the chat.
Good.
If anyone wonders, Parsec is a remote desktop client.
Good point. I didn't mention that specifically, but Parsec is just a way of logging into another computer. So Jonas had set up the Parsec receiving end, the software running on the cloud computer, and then via my computer I could just remote into that computer. Like TeamViewer, if you're familiar, Google Remote Desktop, all of those ways of accessing a computer remotely over the web. Parsec is one of those many solutions.
And then intense tech check breakout room sounds like a necessity to me. Make those guests meet the minimum standards.
Yeah, it's really important to do the tech check. I will say whenever you get up to like 20 steps or so, it starts to get a little bit nerve-wracking on the other end whenever a guest is joining. Let's say a guest has a talk in 20 minutes time and they join now and their internet is not great, and you find that out in the first step. That time can grow very quickly. Excuse me. So the 20 minutes that they had when they joined disappears very fast. So the bigger the tech check becomes, the faster that time goes. So it's always good to ask them to join really early or relatively early so you can get through all of those lists. And then sometimes it did happen where the tech check was still going on because someone's internet wasn't great or some problem was occurring, and because they didn't join in enough time in advance as well. So eventually you just have to say, okay, let's just express this. Maybe we don't get to fix their camera location, but we should make sure we can hear them, make sure that their screen share works, and then just send them through. So it's good to be extensive, but you have to be willing to let things fall as well if time starts to run out. Okay, question?
Yep. From Robbie. ZoomISO, question mark?
ZoomISO. ZoomISO, the software, is not something we use for this one, if that's what you're wondering, Robbie. Since this was all happening in the cloud, we weren't running any local hardware with ZoomISO running on it. You could, in theory, do something very similar with ZoomISO. In fact, I showed it off on a stream before. I believe I showed it off anyway, but I used it once before, where I pinned people out of outputs on ZoomISO. Worked nicely. But this being all cloud-based, running the Zoom rooms into each of the breakout rooms really makes sense for that use case. Okay, let me just wrap up my last few little pieces here before I run out of time for the day. What did I learn? I had a couple of lessons learned that I made note of. I don't have to show them, I guess. So comms was a big part of this, and I saw someone mentioning before that they used Slack. Yeah. So Robbie here saying primarily use Slack and Unity, but have switched over to Discord since we can talk and chat at the same time. Yeah, that makes sense. Having those two things, a talking mechanism and a chatting text chat mechanism, is really important, because some things you need to say instantly. You know, the guest is late. We need 5 more minutes. That needs to be said to everybody instantly. Whereas a question like, in 2 hours time, this thing is going to happen. Who do you want to introduce the guest? You don't need an answer on that for another 1 hour and 50 minutes. So having a text chat like Slack, or in your case, using Discord, is a really nice way to do it. I think that's smart to use one app. Although if Discord has a problem that day, you probably want to be ready to switch to another application and have a backup for sure. But on the notion of comms, it's something I've used for a few different shows, whether that be local with people on headsets, like the Hollyland comms setup I've used in the past and chatted about, or on Unity. Some of the things that are really important are the being clear and concise. A few times it pops up where people don't know the answer to a question just yet. And I think I could probably do a whole video on like comms etiquette and what I run with usually, or what other people have showed me, or what not to do and what to do. If that's something you're interested in, let me know. But one of the two things I think are most important, one of them is not to use statements like, I think that the client wants this, or I believe that we're going live in 3 minutes, but instead being extremely direct and only having answers whenever you have the actual answer. Like, we're going live in 3 minutes, or we will start this in 60 seconds. I think it's an easy thing to fall into, which is thinking that you know the answer and then just saying it, and in a very, I'm not even making myself clear here, but in a very unsure way. Saying anything in an unsure way just doesn't help. It's better not to say anything at all. And the other comms related thing when it comes to the text chat. Now, what you don't want to do if someone's hosting a show is talk into their ear, because they'll not be able to hear what you're saying and communicate it with their usual sentences otherwise. So what we used for the hosts was text. And we were aware that they were checking every once in a while. Like, they would ask the guest a question, and then they would look at their text chat and say, you know, what are people saying? Robbie here saying, copy that. Thanks, Robbie. There was time for them to read, but it was super important to be very concise and use every character very carefully, because they don't have much time to read things. Now, you'll notice whenever I'm doing this show that I get distracted and start reading text, and it runs, it throws me off course. So whenever you want to give them directions, the same thing applies. Give them very direct statements like, here's exactly what I want you to say. Say, we're going to take a short break. We'll see you in 5 minutes. That would be a good example of something for the hosts to read as they glance over. A quote that they should just read out loud. A bad example would be sending them a message that says something like, we're starting to run behind time, we're thinking about doing this thing, we're not sure if we should go to a break now, maybe we should go for a 5-minute break. There's just not enough time for them to really process that, decide on something, and then know what to do. So comms, as always, is a big part. Not something I've covered heavily on the channel before, because a lot of the stuff that I do these days is either this live stream or some videos, or maybe I'm out on a job and it's only me and one other person and we're sitting beside each other. But comms is a fun thing, and I would like to dig into that. I'm seeing some other people would like to see some comms related things. Is that right?
Both Eric, who says comms etiquette would be a good episode topic, and also Robbie.
Cool.
And I'm guessing more people too.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'll look into that, definitely. It might be one of those things that people have their own ways of saying certain phrases, but in general, I think a lot of us agree on the same kind of stuff. All right, I hope you enjoyed that little dig in behind the scenes. It ended up being visual with H2R gear, which helped. And it was it was kind of interesting to try to describe a process behind something without actually having the footage to show anybody. But I liked it. Alrighty, thanks so much for tuning in. If you want to join us for a bit more chit chat, we'll be in the members only call after the live show. It always happens, and you can join us by clicking on the join link below the videos, and then you'll get a link to the Zoom call, and we chat some more about the show or whatever else pops up. Random things. We were talking about AI a bit before the show here, so who knows what will come up in the post show. Thanks so much for watching along, as always, and thanks to Sani for asking all the questions, and the Supreme supporters too. Off Air with Jezza, Revolution Lightboards, Marlin, and Cloud Bedrock as well. And thanks to all you for asking questions and saying useful things during the show. See you next time. Bye-bye.